Hello and welcome to The Print. The recent nosedive in India-Canada relations isn't coming out of the blue. There's a 40-year history to it, dating back to the peak of the Sikh separatist movement. The Sikh separatist sentiment has maintained a tenacious grip over a section of Sikhs in Canada, an important vote bank for Justin Trudeau, as India's Ministry of External Affairs reminds us. But the long-drawn history of hatred still hurts the broader Sikh community in Canada, many of who are still haunted by the horrors of the Air India flight bombing and its aftermath. So let's take a walk down institutional memory lane and revisit the worst terrorist attack in Canadian history. This is a story of how a terrorist attack happened in broad daylight and how its perpetrators were let off. In fact, two co-conspirators, Surjan Singh Gill and Ripurdaman Singh Malik, have recently re-entered the news cycle with allegations flying around that the Indian government has taken matters into their own hands. On 23 June 1985, Air India Flight 182, known as Emperor Kanishka, disintegrated mid-air on its way from Canada to India. All 329 members on board were killed. It was an unthinkable act of mass murder orchestrated by Sikh extremists and the deadliest act of aviation terrorism before 9/11. It came after months of Indo-Canadians saying the same thing: Air India ki flight mat lo. This was because there were rumors for months among the Indian diaspora in Canada that something big was going to happen. Plenty of signs were visible too, but no one was paying close attention. The whispers eventually grew loud enough for the Indian Intelligence Bureau to hear. They sent out a telex to both Canadian authorities and the Air India administration as early as 1 June 1985, asking them to take security measures against a possible airplane attack by Sikh extremists. But that wasn't all. Days before the bombing, Canadian intelligence operatives were tracking Talwinder Singh Parmar, founder and leader of terrorist group Babar Khalsa International, BKI, or Tigers of True Faith, heard an explosives test that he conducted in a forest. They ignored it, mistaking it to be gunshots. But surveillance was called off the very next day. And what's more is that Canadian security was lax despite the evidence of threat. Sniffer dogs were missing from across Canadian airports because all of them were at a training session in Vancouver. X-ray screens at Toronto's Pearson Airport broke down on the day of the flight. Meanwhile, a man called Manjeet Singh called the airlines on 22nd June, asked if his ticket was confirmed, and was told that he was on the waiting list. He then asked for his Samsonite luggage to be checked in regardless. And therein was planted the bomb on Flight 182, a Boeing 747 plane named Emperor Kanishka. The handheld sniffers, which were supposed to scream near explosives, did beep around the bag, but security personnel weren't trained to detect the signal, so they let it pass. Then, at Montreal's Mirabel Airport, the first stop after takeoff from Pearson, several suspicious bags were identified. However, cost considerations motivated Air India officials to allow Flight 182 to depart. The plane was already late, and the airlines would have to pay a fee otherwise. And so the suitcase with explosives took off, along with the 329 passengers on board. Perhaps the most damning of all, James Bartleman, then head of Canada's Intelligence Bureau, saw a highly classified communication security establishment document that told him the weekly Flight 182 would be targeted by Sikh extremists. When he brought it to the official of an RCMP or Canadian Police, which is the Canadian Police officials, they were met with a hostile reception and told that the matter was being probed by the officials. When he further testified to this in court, Canadian authorities did their best to discredit him. All these deadly lapses are chronicled in unsparing detail in the 2010 report of the John Major Commission, appointed in 2006 by the Canadian government to look into the bombing and the role of both intelligence and police. Headed by retired Canadian Supreme Court Justice John Major, the Commission's findings chronicle a shocking level of laxity, coming down hard on the Canadian authorities. The report points out that the cascading series of errors that led to the largest mass murder in Canadian history and one of the most significant terror attacks on an airplane. Over the years, critics have referred to the Canadian authorities' attitudes as racially tinged and negligent. This indifference, they say, also currently informs the Canadian government's response to Sikh extremist supporters. Although multiple people were arrested and tried for the 1985 crime, including Parmar, only one was convicted to 15 years in prison, Inderjeet Singh Rayat. Some of the others associated with the Kanishka bombing were allowed to re-enter Canadian society and were seen to be close to Canadian officials. It wasn't a cascading series of errors, it was an intelligence failure. Unless you describe criminal negligence and collusion as failure, says Ajay Sani, founding member and executive director of the Institute for Conflict Management. The plans to bomb the plane were reported as early as 1984, according to veteran journalist Terry Milewski. The actual attack involved 2 bombs assembled by Vancouver Island-based auto mechanic Inderjeet Singh Rayat. He had taken his orders from Parmar, who was originally from Punjab's Kapurthala district and had emigrated to Canada in 1970 when he was about 26 years old. Parmar became a Canadian citizen in 1976, with his adopted nation and Pakistan serving as basis for his rise to prominence, according to Milewski. Rayat would claim years later, during a court trial, that he was unaware of the purpose of these bombs, but local Canadian witnesses had contradicted him, citing his stated desires for revenge for Operation Blue Star and inquiries about dynamite ahead of the bombing. For about 2 months prior to the attack, which is often dubbed as Canada's 9/11, Rayat assembled and tested bombs, while Parmar reportedly coordinated with fellow Babar Khalsa militants, using payphones and communicating in code. Manjeet Singh, who was supposed to board the flight, managed to deceive a CP Air agent at Vancouver Airport to check in his bomb bag onto Flight 182. This was despite not having a confirmed flight ticket beyond the Vancouver to Toronto leg of the India-bound flight, which was scheduled to stop over at London's Heathrow and Delhi's Palam Airport before ending in Mumbai. That fateful dark brown Samsonite bag evaded the beefed-up Canadian airport security requested by Air India for Toronto and Montreal. The bomb aboard the flight exploded over the Atlantic Ocean, killing all aboard. That same day, another Babar Khalsa militant successfully checked in a bag containing a bomb onto a CP Air flight bound from Vancouver to Japan's Narita International Airport from Vancouver in the absence of X-ray security checking. This bomb bag was intended for Air India Flight 301, scheduled from Narita to Bangkok. The plan was for the bomb to explode at the same time as the one on Flight 182, but the blast took place an hour earlier at Narita Airport as militants had failed to account for Japan not observing daylight savings time. 2 Japanese bag handlers were killed in the explosion. All this is to say that it was a coordinated, planned attack that originally intended to cause further damage on multiple Air India flights. But back to Kanishka. Out of 329 Kanishka fatalities, only 131 bodies were found. The wreckage was strewn across the Atlantic Ocean, the remains off the coast of Ireland. Then began another story of official indifference. According to testimony from victims' families, when they landed in London en route to Ireland to identify the bodies of their loved ones, there was no Canadian presence at Heathrow Airport to help them. In contrast, Air India had arranged for free passage from Canada to Ireland, and the Indian ambassador to the United Kingdom was described as very helpful and supportive. The Air India 182 trial was the longest and most expensive one in Canada's history, dragging on for over 2 decades and costing nearly $130 million. Yet, for all of this, it was largely an exercise in futility. The events of 1985 and subsequent years followed a trajectory of disaster to disorder to disregard to defeat. From a promising start with the RCMP and the Canadian Security Intelligence Services, CSIS, launching investigations in 1985 to Rayat being charged with manslaughter and possession of bombs in 1981, the trial reached a plateau after Parmar was killed in police custody in India in 1992. Now, Parmar was a central figure in the 1981 murder of 2 Punjab police officers amidst his terrorist activities in India, but he went back to Canada and even travelled to West Germany. Both countries refused to extradite Parmar to India, with West Germany jailing him for a year before letting him go. Western governments were not keen to take sides in India's internal battles, Milewski wrote in his book Blood for Blood. In the years following the Flight 182 bombing, Parmar moved to Pakistan in 1988 and continued his activities underground across the border in Punjab. He was lured across the border by intelligence officials and died in custody in Punjab on the orders of senior Punjab police officers. The trial, meanwhile, was going nowhere, and the RCMP even offered a $1 million reward for information leading to conviction in 1995. It was around this time that Tara Singh Hare, publisher of the Indo-Canadian Times and a staunch critic of Sikh extremism and a crucial witness, gave the RCMP a much-needed smoking gun. He submitted an affidavit to the RCMP mentioning a conversation between Ajaib Singh Bagri, Parmar's right hand and one of the accused in the bombing, that he overheard and which practically laid out the entire plan. According to the affidavit, Bagri said that the purpose of the attack was to make the Indian government come on their knees and give them Khalistan. If everything had gone to plan, the plane would have blown up in Heathrow Airport with no passengers, but because the flight was delayed, it blew up over the ocean, Bagri reportedly told his friend. But in 1998, Hare was assassinated in Canada's Surrey. His murderers were never found. 2 years later, informant Surjan Singh Gill, who once called himself the Consular General of Khalistan and was a close friend of Parmar, destroyed 150 hours of taped conversations with Sikh extremists instead of turning them over to RCMP. Allegedly working as a CSIS mole, Gill had infiltrated Sikh circles and was reportedly instructed by his bosses in the intelligence agency to pull out 3 days before the bombing when officials recognized how serious the threat was, allegedly to avoid Canadian intelligence seeming complicit in the attack. In 2003, Rayat pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The trial of Ajaib Singh Bagri and Ripud Amar Singh Malik, the BKI financier, began soon after. In an unexpected turn of events, the Crown's key witness turned up, a woman who claimed that Malik fell in love with her during the early 90s. She claimed he had confessed to her about the bombing of Air India 182. Another key witness, who had been captured meeting with Bagri on CSIS cameras, said she couldn't recall the visit at all. With evidence wiped out and witnesses either silenced or dead, both Malik and Bagri were acquitted of all charges in 2005. Malik walked out of Vancouver's BC Supreme Court doors with a smile on his face. He was gunned down in Canada's Surrey in July 2022. Even though 278 of the 329 victims were Canadian citizens, the attitude of the Canadian authorities and government seemed to be that they were just foreign casualties of a foreign conflict. Ultimately, the bombing became a hot potato issue. For Indians, it was a foreign tragedy, and for Canadians, it was something that the brown guys were up to. Over 20 years later, the Stephen Harper-led Canadian government established the John Major Commission of Inquiry. But not much seemed to have changed about how the attack was perceived in Canada. But it did become a political landmine. Over the next few decades, nobody in Canada's political firmament directly addressed the issue of Sikh separatism. This hesitation stemmed from the fear of labeling the entire Sikh community as a threat and also the consideration of losing votes, noted Ron Atke, chair of CSIS watchdog, the Security Intelligence Review Committee, all the way back in 2010. Similarly, addressing the apathies of authorities to the bombing victims ran the risk of branding Canadians as racist, which could also cause backlash. The outcome was that Sikh extremism was allowed to proliferate unchecked in Canada, even as systemic bias was left unaddressed. According to the Major report, the RCMP viewed witnesses as criminals and treated them with skepticism, expecting them to put up or shut up. Amidst this, it was Indo-Canadians and moderate Sikhs who had nowhere to go and nobody to turn to. While posters of Parmar and militant leader Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale were plastered at gurudwaras and both figures hailed as martyrs, key witnesses and moderate Sikhs lived under the fog of fear well into the late 90s. Even in recent years, the Air India bombing has occasionally come up as a contentious issue for Canadian Sikh politicians, including Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the New Democratic Party and prime ministerial candidate in 2019. When Jagmeet took over the party leadership in October 2017, he reportedly refused to denounce the display of posters of Martyr Parmar at a Gurudwara in Surrey, near Vancouver. Jagmeet had termed Miluski's question about the incident as offensive. It wasn't until March 2018 that Jagmeet denounced the glorification of Parmar and accepted that the Air India inquiry's conclusion that Parmar was a mastermind behind the bombing. And while Jagmeet Singh has been making public statements on the recent escalation of tensions, including calling for a ban on the RSS, he hasn't said a word about Kanishka. Meanwhile, the families and loved ones of those who died in the bombing are trying to keep the memory of Kanishka alive, because ultimately, history can be easily forgotten. Thank you for listening, and read more about the Kanishka bombing in our Pass Forward, which will be linked down below, and keep watching The Print for such content.